Okay, it's NJ Gloiper. We're back, and we're reading Chapter 12 of Sources of Power by Gary Klein. Chapter 12 is titled The Power of Metaphors and Analogues. If anybody has anything they want to add, any discussion they want to have about the book, or anything related to the book, feel free to request at any time. And if I think you'll add to the discussion or the conversation, I'll bring you guys up. But let's jump right in. Let me get a drink of water. Okay. The Power of Metaphors and Analogues. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese commander Mitsuo Fuchito was surprised by its success. He asked, had these Americans never heard of Port Arthur? That event, which was famous in Japan, had preceded the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. The Japanese tactic was to destroy the Russian Pacific Fleet at anchor at Port Arthur in a surprise attack. The tactic worked, and to the amazement of the world, the Japanese won the war. People use analogues and metaphors to perform a variety of difficult tasks, understanding situations, generating predictions, solving problems, anticipating events, designing equipment, and making plans. An analogue is an event or an example drawn from the same or a related domain as the task at hand. A metaphor comes from a markedly different domain. Each experience we have, whether it is our own or one we have heard about from someone else, can serve as an analog or a metaphor. Each time we take on a task, we can draw on this vast knowledge base, this bank of experiences and stories and images. We may overlook an analog, select a misleading one, or fail to interpret one correctly. Usually, our experience bank works smoothly, providing us with structure and interpretation, even for tasks we have not been faced with before. Yeah, so one thing that humans are really good at is generalizing or pattern recognition. So mapping something they've seen onto I guess any other event or some new information. So our neurons, our neural connections, they're able to recognize features. We call that feature detection in AI or machine learning research. And it's scalable. So you can match single features and you can build patterns that match multiple features. And a lot of times these are what you would call, let's just for the sake of this discussion, call it rotation independent, or they're called isomorphic. So they can be viewed from any angle. So a pattern of, let's just say, the letter A. Let's just say that we can recognize the letter A. We can recognize the character A, whether it's upside down, rotated 90 degrees, whether it's skewed or in some perspective transform. It doesn't bother us. It doesn't deter us from reading or recognizing the letter A. So, but we can build up that recognition for multiple patterns. So if you think about the letter A, specifically the capital letter A, it's made of three lines. We have the two, what would you call it, diagonal lines that make up the outer shape of the A, and then you have the horizontal one that bridges the two. That's all feature detection. We recognize the lines and the pattern of them, and it can be, like I said, isomorphic. We recognize it at any perspective or transformation angle, and we can build on that. We can find entire words that have the capital letter A. We can find paragraphs, and we can find, entire sentences, paragraphs. We can find books and articles that have the capital letter A in it. And it doesn't have to be just the letter A. It can be a colored letter A. It can be the letter A moving. So if you're in a vehicle and you're reading a sign while you're driving, you can do that. So there's any number of transformations you can do to this in different situations, in different lighting conditions. Whether you're tired and you're sleepy or you're energetic and awake, You think of any condition and you can read it. Of course, it becomes harder to read it with like blurred vision or something, but you can still kind of make it out. You can still kind of, find an analog, or you've seen so many A's before. You could be pretty certain if you see a blurry one, you might have found another A. So it's all about the seeing it before and then, mapping what you've seen before onto the new situation. Seeing a new font that you've never seen before, seeing someone you've never met before write the letter A in their own handwriting. It's not some mysterious character that you have to like analyze and, what is the angle between the two slanted lines, and does the character or the line in the middle bridge the two correctly? You don't have to get out a protractor to measure it to see if it's the character A. You just know it's the character A. And we're very good at this. Humans are very good at feature detection. We're very robust creatures. So yes, we are good at analogues. We are good at mapping new information onto our experienced, the information we have experienced through ourselves, or even through written word, or spoken language. We can kind of embody someone else's experiences. We're very good at this. We may overlook an analog, select a misleading one, or fail to interpret one correctly. Usually, our experience bank works smoothly, providing us with structure and interpretation, even for tasks we have not been faced with before. In the early 1980s, engineers given the task of estimating how long the auxiliary power unit of a B-1 aircraft would last before it had to be repaired looked up the data for the same unit on a C-5A airplane to get a ballpark figure. The C-5A auxiliary power unit was an analog that they used for prediction. Around the same time, yeah, that's so weird seeing his name not said. It wasn't written Steve here. I'm going to read it like it was written. Stephen Jobs. Yeah, how weird is that? I'm so used to hearing Steve Jobs. Stephen Jobs and Steve Wozniak were designing the Macintosh computer, using ideas they had seen at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Hewlett-Packard, and other places. They adopted the idea of making the interface of the Macintosh work like a desktop. Users could see folders, maneuver a mouse to pick up one folder and put it in another, and so forth. The concept of a desktop was a metaphor for using the Macintosh interface. So that's something I hadn't really, thought too much about. But yeah, the word desktop, it's literally like you're looking at a desk from the top view. Like you're looking at you're just sitting at a desk. You have a bunch of folders and files and you can move things around. Yeah, I never, obviously the analog and the metaphor is there for you to experience it, but I never like visualized it. So that's strange that I never made that connection. But yeah, that's why we call it desktops. I thought it was because we put the computer on the desktop, like a laptop. You put it on your lap. I thought it was like this thing goes on your desktop. So, okay, well, you live and you learn, I guess. The logic of metaphorical reasoning. Once metaphors were treated simply as adornments to language. An English teacher would cite a favorite example from Shakespeare, perhaps, "My love is like a red rose," and we were all supposed to lean back in our seats, giddy with the fragrance of the metaphor. This is actually a simile because it uses like, but we need not worry here about these types of details. However, researchers have been trying to understand the way metaphors affect our thinking, as well as our emotional reactions. They've found that metaphors affect what we see and how we interpret it. Lakoff and Johnson, and that's Lakoff, and Johnson's just spelled Johnson, in 1980, in their book Metaphors We Live By, showed that metaphors govern the way that we think about issues. The metaphor, "Arguments are like war," tells us we should be attacking each other's positions, particularly the weak points, and defending our own weaknesses. If we use the metaphor, "Arguments are like music practice," We would be using arguments as an opportunity to find out how we are each contributing to disharmonies. Lakoff in 1986 has shown that a woman who complains to her boyfriend that this relationship isn't going anywhere is using the metaphor of a journey for assessing the relationship. What's up, stimulant? A journey has a beginning, a clear ending, and an expectation of continual progress. If progress ceases, then it is no longer a journeyer. Sorry, it's the case where there's no hyphen in the PDF. Then it is no longer a journey, or in this case, a worthwhile relationship. A different metaphor that a relationship is an arch would convey that the pieces achieve more together than they could individually. They transcend themselves, and success is seen as stability rather than change and progress. Lakoff and Johnson and other researchers have made us aware of the metaphors that guide our thinking. A metaphor uses a base domain, a familiar domain, to achieve situation awareness. That is, to interpret and understand a new domain. Political debate can be seen as a struggle for the defining metaphors. This is going to be very useful for me to articulate how I think about these things. So I like key points. I'm reaching out to the audience. I'm like shaking you right now. Like, okay, this is an important point. Okay, pay attention. In the United States, when there is an opportunity or need to help a small country in the midst of a civil war, the metaphor of a schoolyard may be introduced. One of the stronger students steps between two smaller children, having a scrap, letting them cool off before they can do too much damage. This is a heroic image. The counter metaphor is usually the tar baby image from the Uncle Remus stories, an image of trying to help but getting stuck further and further in the tar until it is impossible to be extracted. This is frightening and a vivid metaphor usually tied to the Vietnam experience. Metaphor does more than adorn our thinking. It structures our thinking. That's a weird sentence pattern. Feels redundant. So metaphors don't just adorn our thinking, it structures our thinking. It conditions our sympathies and emotional reactions. It helps us achieve situation awareness. That bird was really close. You guys probably heard that. There's a lot of seabirds out here. It governs the evidence we consider salient and the outcomes we elect to pursue. If this framework makes sense, then it should produce some useful implications. To find out, Dent Reed, Klein, and Eggleston in 1994 conducted a study to understand how we might use metaphor to design equipment. We began by interviewing the leading metaphor researchers to see what suggestions they might make. None of them had any helpful ideas, and some were discouraging, arguing that metaphors cannot be put to work in this way. Then we shifted to designers themselves, visiting and interviewing people identified as producing innovative systems and interfaces. If you guys remember the old Apple interfaces from the old, like, I don't know, the iPhone 4 and below, like around those eras, like probably 2010, they had the skeuomorphic interfaces where, if you remember, the YouTube icon was literally a TV, stuff like that, where I think the Game Center, it was like the pool table felt background. So like it just drew on the real world and mapped it onto the digital world. So materials in the real world kind of, what would you call it, represented or informed us of what the application was supposed to do or achieve or what you could do inside the app. So the limitations of the app or the space of the app, the domain. So I don't know why these idiots, these metaphor researchers, just couldn't think of that one. Why can't you think of, like, I can think of numerous examples where metaphors inform uh, the way we think. But I don't know. I guess this is why you don't trust the experts all the time on anything. You got to be a skeptic. You got to, think for yourself. So then we shifted to designers themselves, visiting and interviewing people identified as producing innovative systems and interfaces. So these guys are visionaries. They're forward thinking. And I will say, I think 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I, the 20th, I think the 20th, yeah, this version of the book is the 20th anniversary edition. So this book was like published at least 20 years ago. Um, Back then, interfaces were a lot more varied. Um, there weren't like, I guess, what would you call it? There wasn't a consensus on what, a website or an application or a main menu or even like parts of applications were supposed to look like. Now we have like entire design style guides and rule books for like how things should be designed. Like Google has the material design. I guess you would call it like rule book or guide. And you have style sheet bootstrapping things like literally Bootstrap or Tailwind. These are frameworks, CSS frameworks to style your website in a concise and consistent manner. It uses the same design language. That's what we call it across interfaces across the internet. So websites behave like other websites, and that kind of makes the user feel like they're at home, like they know what to expect from clicking a button or using a drop down and stuff like that. Nothing unexpected happens. So we've come to use a shared language for our interfaces and how websites look and how apps look and how your phone screen looks. Phone lock screens all pretty much look the same, excuse me, where it's like swipe to unlock, or you have like a PIN code to enter, or you have like the Face ID and stuff, but I'm sure you can still use the old backup, pins as a setting or whatever. But yeah, like there's this, they call it the iPhoneification. They call it like bimboification. Everything, regresses to some mean or regresses to some point in design space where everything looks like everything else. Cars have done this, for example. A lot of the major car manufacturers, they converge. All the designs converge onto like a singular, like efficient or non, what would you call it? Like non-offensive. It's like a universal design. So nobody's offended by it. It's the easiest to use. It's the most universal. It's the most widely adopted. It's the easiest and most accessible design. So that's what has happened to cell phones. They're all relatively the same shape. They all have the same button placements. A lot of them got rid of the earphone jack after the iPhone did. The headphone jack, the 3mm audio jack, they got rid of that. Pretty much all phones use Type-C connectors now. They all have touchscreen keyboards and interfaces. So it's the iPhoneification. It's the bimboification. Everything is reduced to its like constituent elements, and it becomes like a universal language. The design language of a phone is what most people expect a phone to be and how they've used phones before. So there's this like regression to mean. But anyways, I'm getting off topic. But yeah, the designers were innovative in creating systems and interfaces that were innovative at the time. So it was the unknown. Nobody knew what an iPhone looked like. Someone had to make it. Someone had to think it first. So someone had to innovate and create something new. Someone had to have a vision. So these are the guys that he's interviewing. Here we got the opposite answer, that metaphor was at the core of these designers' work. Some designers explained that every time they considered an interface, they had to consider the metaphors that would be uppermost in the user's minds. For the first word processors, the metaphor was the typewriter, and the job of the interface designer was to build on that metaphor while avoiding dissimilarities. The keyboard was the same, but users did not have to hit the carriage return at the end of each line, and that was going to take some time to get used to. They also had to issue warnings about periodically saving a file so it would not be lost in case the system crashed. This was not a problem with typewriters. We don't have that problem anymore because Google Docs, which is pretty much what everybody on planet Earth uses, automatically saves. So it's better than the typewriter, and it's better than early word processors that, did not really store backups. I can remember one of my first computers doing school projects and the power went out. And these programs didn't, storage space was limited. You had maybe a gigabyte. You probably had 500 megabytes for your desktop hard drive in like 2004, 2003. Didn't have a lot of storage space. So saving files every 5 minutes was actually considered like wasteful. It was bad practice. You would be filling up someone's hard drive if you did that. So let alone version control. Geez, saving different versions of the file every 5 minutes, that's even crazier. So now we have like an abundance of storage space, so we can just save pretty much any kind of file, any kind of user-generated text file as many times as we want, as often as we want, as many versions as we want. We can store it all. It doesn't matter. One designer, John Reising, Reising, of the U.S. Air Force's Flight Dynamics Laboratory, showed us different schemes for helping pilots navigate a safe path through a dangerous airspace. The planners could often determine an effective route in advance, so the task was to help the pilots follow it. One approach Reising showed us was to use the metaphor of a highway in the sky. His displays portrayed a highway on the screen, and the pilots guided their airplanes to fly on this highway. A U.S. Navy approach was to present a phantom airplane on the screen, flying the selected route. Here, the pilots flew in formation with this phantom, following it wherever it went. If they were going to have to start speeding up, the phantom's afterburners would light up. If the pilot was going too fast, the phantom would deploy its drag chute, ordinarily used on landing, to slow down. We learned that effective metaphors were the ones helping to organize action. They were trading in on well-learned behaviors, such as flying formation, driving on a highway, or moving folders on a desktop, so that the new task could be performed smoothly using coordination skills that had already been developed. We also found metaphors that did not help very much, such as a hospital metaphor to show pilots which subsystem of their aircraft was sick. For these ineffective metaphors, the organization was conceptual, not coordinating actions. By noting that the hydraulic system was sick, the interface was not offering anything useful to pilots. The pilots do not have the well-learned reactions to sickness they do to flying in formation. So it's all about feedback in terms of the user. It's all about feedback in the language that the user understands. So you have to know your audience. If you're giving a presidential address, you're not at a comedy club. A comedy club has its own kind of language. You know when someone's trying to make a joke and when there's a punchline and when you're supposed to laugh and when you're supposed to stop laughing. It's all implicit, but there is a language there. There's a role that the audience plays, and there's a role that the comedian plays, and there's an interaction. There's an interplay between the two. So there's like a language. There's an invisible language that's learned from watching it on TV and going to these shows and talking to funny people throughout your life. You don't have to go to a comedy show to know how to act. All the late night shows like Stephen Colbert and let me think of another one if I can, the Jon Stewart Show, stuff like that. It's all like using the user's language of comedy. It's using the timing and the speech patterns and the inflections, and it's kind of giving you the example of the audience, that's using the audience, the pre-screened audience laughter as a metaphor for what you should be doing. It's kind of telling you how to act. It's giving you the cue and the response, the behavior patterns, and you're learning from that. And then the next time you go to a comedy show, that's kind of informed you how to react. So there's like this language. There's language that you can use from the real world and from other people's experience, and you can shape other people's actions and thoughts just from that past experience that they may not have even experienced firsthand. We can also see that metaphor can be used for training. On an airplane trip, I was once sitting next to a woman studying a tennis book. The book specified the proper form for each stroke. For hitting the ball at the net, the legs were supposed to be so many inches apart, shown in an illustration as the length of a racket. The arms would be at the proper height, elbows flexed at the proper angle, racket head facing the proper direction, and so forth. I could not imagine how anyone could ever swing at the ball, trying to remember so many rules. I compared that approach to the advice I once heard from an experienced instructor that hitting a ball at the net is like pushing a pie into someone's face. In short, it was not like stroking the ball, hitting a forehand. It was a choppy motion. I just realized he said stroking the ball. Pause. Yo, hold up. Did people actually say that in tennis? That's crazy. It was a choppy motion. Although few of the students actually had pushed a pie into anyone's face, the metaphor was compelling. It achieved its effect of coordinating arms, legs, and body, and timing for a difficult shot that most of the students had previously been hitting poorly. The instructor also taught the students that to hit a backhand in tennis, they should try to imagine they were throwing a frisbee. Again, the metaphor provided an overall feel for body flow in performing the action. When an action is decomposed into its elements, the chore of coordinating those elements comes at the end. With a metaphor, the overall coordinations was the starting point. We all have seen Happy Gilmore. That's like the archetypal example of this. It's like the guy who was good at hockey and became a good golfer. So he hits all his golf swings like he's swinging a hockey stick. So the metaphor. In trying to understand how people solve ill-defined problems, one strategy is to try to reach a goal while simultaneously trying to define the goal, using failures to specify the goal more clearly. There is a second strategy, to find an analogy that suggested features of the goal. For instance, if my car won't start, my goal is to get the engine running. If I recall a time when I left the lights on by mistake and killed the battery, I might figure out that the lights run directly off the battery. Therefore, I could test whether the battery is okay by turning on the lights to see if they work. If they don't, then my problem is not the vague one of getting the engine started, but the specific one of overcoming a dead battery. Analogical reasoning can also suggest options. If I drive a car with a manual transmission, perhaps I recall a time when I saw someone start such a car by letting it roll downhill to get the engine started without a working battery. But there are no hills near me. Perhaps I can have my passengers push the car to create the necessary force. There are several hypotheses about how analogical reasoning works. One approach was the work of Robert Sternberg in 1977, who studied the components of solving analog problems. A equals B and C equals D, for example. Dog is to flee as shark is to whale, remora, eel, or squid. The correct answer would be remora, since it attaches itself to the shark, rides along with it, and depends on it for food. I didn't know that. I've never even seen that word before. Remora? Interesting. Sternberg's research was carefully done and interesting, but this model of the components is not very helpful for two reasons. One was that he was working on fairly artificial types of problems with limited context. Even worse, Sternberg gave his subjects the second term of the analog. He told them what analog to use. In contrast, problem solvers have to find an appropriate analogy to use themselves. Yeah, you're not given a multiple choice answer when your car doesn't start. there's nothing that pops up that's like, is it A, the battery, or B, the alternator? We're not so lucky. In most cases, finding a good analogy is the hardest part of the job, and that requires experience. My phone is at like 12% battery. Let me go get my portable charger and plug it in. I'll be right back. Give me one moment. And if anybody wants to request, if anybody has anything they want to add, feel free to request at any point, and I can bring you guys up. I'm going to walk with my phone, so if I see anybody request or put their hand up, I'll bring you guys up. Hope you guys are enjoying the space so far. It's a pretty mediocre chapter. I mean, I'm not blown away yet. Chapter 11 was a little bit better so far, but definitely 5 and 10. If you haven't listened to those ones, go back and listen to chapter 5 and chapter 10. Those were my favorite chapters. Those were straight up bangers. All right, I'm gonna check the comments. I'm plugged in now, and then we'll get back into it. Let's see here. All right. Really? There we go. All right. Stimmy left a comment. Just waiting for it to load. On my way to kill that bird for interrupting the content. Yeah, thank you. Just yeah. Just kill birds. No, they're so annoying. The seabirds around here, they are loud and they sound like howling monkeys at night. When they do their call. I don't know if it's like a mating call or if it's like I found food or something, but they are so loud. And it sounds like freaking monkeys. All right. We're back. Okay. Okay. Another approach was offered by Amos Tversky, and I think this is, I could be wrong, but the last book we read, Thinking Fast and Slow, by, oh my gosh, why am I forgetting his name? That's crazy. Let me go back because I saw his name earlier. Klein. No, not Klein. Dude, what the fuck is his name? I'm having like a what was Obama's last name moment. I'm doing this right now, aren't I? Oh my gosh. Kahneman. Yeah. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He and Amos, so he had a colleague and a coworker and whatever named Amos. So I'm wondering if this is the same Amos. I don't remember what Amos's last name was, but it could be the same guy. It's around the same time frame, but Amos Tversky, Tversky, and Amos is Amos. So Amos Tversky offered another approach, and this guy Amos Tversky, had proposed a method for defining similarity in terms of the number of elements two items shared in common. Yeah, what's up, Witness? Good to see you, man. By the way, you guys should follow Witness. This guy's been popping off lately. He does some really good research, so if you're interested in the politics, definitely follow this guy. If you have anything you want to add at any time, feel free to jump in, by the way. This method could explain how people judged degree of similarity and satisfied themselves that a similar case was worth using. The difficulty is that every pair of items shares an infinite number of features in common. Take this book and your left shoe. They are both closer to the moon than the sun, both closer to the sun than to the center of the Milky Way, both lighter than your car, both larger than your mouth, and so on forever. This kind of goes back to, I posted that video, that clip of Jordan Peterson talking about perception. And say what you will about Peterson, when he was just doing academic stuff, that's when he was actually good. He did a lecture on perception, and he was talking about how there's an infinite number of facts in a finite space. So you can talk about your room, you can talk about a building, you can talk about a stadium, you can talk about a city, you could talk about a country. Any level of finite space, any local area, even if it's bounded, has an infinite number of details, facts about that space. And the job of humans, the job we have, is to determine what facts we perceive are useful to us, which perceptions are useful to analyzing and shaping the world around us in a meaningful way. So how do we derive meaning from the infinite set of facts that we're perceiving at all times? And one of the conceptions of modern science, the modern psychologists, the way they view the world is that we view the world as tools. We don't view the world as facts. We don't view the world as data, or we don't perceive everything as some data point. We view the world as tools and obstacles. So something is either useful to us and our goals. It can advance us towards getting what we want, or it inhibits us. So you can think of it as inhibitors and disinhibitors. And that's the correct way to think about it. So yes, there is an infinite amount of details about any two things and there's infinite similarities. You can come up with any litany of similarities between two things, even if they're very different. So we have to be making value judgments all the time, or we have to have a lot of experience. Those are the two things that we can do. We can be in a new environment, but we'll be overwhelmed. We'll be constantly having to make value judgments and analyzing something and determining how is it valuable to us? How is it getting me what I want? Or vice versa, how is it getting in the way? How can I get around this thing? So that's if we're in a new space, if we're outside our comfort zone, if we're experiencing things for the first time. But if we're comfortable, if we've been somewhere before, we've seen something before, we can make analogies. We can find what's similar because we've seen it before, or at least we've seen an analog of it before. We can make judgments about it based on its similarities and how we've judged things in the past, whether it's helpful to us or it's going to get in our way. Merely counting common features would not work either. The features in common had to be important ones. They had to be features that had the same cause and effect relationships. Julian Weizenfeld, and that's Weitzенfeld, in 1984, determined that similarity does not make sense without purpose. If your purpose is to start a car with a dead battery, letting it roll downhill and pushing it on a level stretch of highway are similar actions. If your purpose is to start a car that is out of gasoline, letting it roll down a hill to a nearby telephone booth is not the same thing as pushing it on a level stretch of highway. You cannot just look at the two actions, letting the car roll and actively pushing it, and determine if they are similar. It depends on what you want to do. So like I just said, it depends on your goals. We see things as tools or obstacles. A coffee can and an inner tube are both similar as containers for transporting gasoline. They are dissimilar as ways of maintaining an even pressure on the tires of a bicycle. Weizenfeld and I studied the way people actually used analogies. We had discovered a community of engineers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base who make extensive use of analogies to solve difficult problems. While Julian and I were thinking about how people apply analogues, this community was doing it every single day. The engineers we studied were faced with an important and difficult task: predicting the repair rates of the component parts of new airplanes before the airplanes were ever built. If the engineers overestimated the reliability, the Air Force would not stock up on enough spare parts. The airplanes might have to stop flying, while manufacturers made more spares. If the engineers underestimated reliability, then the Air Force would have warehouses filled with unnecessary spare parts and waste taxpayers' money. It was important to make accurate predictions. The engineers would have preferred to use an analytical method to figure out the reliability, but there were no good analytical methods for making the predictions. In 1971, two people figured out a strategy for the engineers to use. One was Major Don Tetmeyer, working in the U.S. Air Force's Directorate of Engineering at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The other was Frank Mayer, a psychologist working for a private company near the base. The strategy they came up with was to use data on similar pieces of equipment. They called their method comparability analysis. It works in this way. First, define as well as you can the system whose reliability you want to predict. Second, find the closest example possible of a similar system being used by the Defense Department. So define and then find a similar one. So we're going to identify, twins essentially. We're trying to find the closest thing we can. Third, explain the rationale for selecting that system. So you're just going to justify it. You're going to articulate why you chose it. So basically, enumerate all the similarities and differences. And lastly, we're going to gather the data on the reliability of that system. Since comparability analysis was developed, it has also been applied in the Air Force for a variety of new aircraft, and it is also widely used in the Navy and the Army. Julian and I realized that this was a good example of analogical reasoning. In studying the way comparability analysis had been used in predicting the reliability of the subsystems on a bomber, the B-1 aircraft, we found straightforward applications and some interesting twists. Here is an example of a straightforward case. Example 12.1, sizing up the ducts. That's D-U-C-T-S, ducts. It's very hard to say. Okay. The B-1 duct system is similar to the duct system of the FB-111 aircraft, except that the B-1 is larger and needs more ducting. Therefore, the FB-111 numbers are adjusted upward by the right proportion. In this example, FB stands for fighter bomber. Here is a slightly more complex case. Example 12.2, pressurizing the hydraulic system. To estimate the reliability of the hydraulic system on the B-1 airplane, an engineer chooses as his comparison case the hydraulic system on the B-52, the airplane that the B-1 is supposed to replace. However, the B-1 hydraulic is going to use 4,000 pounds per square inch of pressure versus 3,000 psi for the B-52. The engineer recognizes that the higher pressure will cause increased wear and lower reliability, so he takes the reliability data for the B-52 hydraulic and reduces it by a third. He doesn't think that the B1 hydraulic system will be as reliable as the B-52. Others might disagree with his estimate. They might claim that the new materials used in the B1 would help things out. Even if they disagreed, they could see the rationale for his prediction, and they could add their own adjustments. These predictions work in the following way. A set of factors affects the reliability of a hydraulic system. We know how many of them, but not all of them, and we don't know how they interact with each other. If we can find an analogy with which we feel comfortable, we can use it because it reflects the full set of causal factors, even the ones we cannot yet identify. So this is like hearkening back to the last chapter where a story is like an experiment, and I'm using a metaphor. I'm using a metaphor to describe the previous chapter, which is meta explanation. It's if I feel like I'm like 2 layers deep in this, but okay, I'm going to use a metaphor to explain how this chapter is like the last chapter. And the last chapter was about stories, which is like, which is describing stories like metaphors, the metaphor of a science experiment. So a science experiment, we know all the variables. We're reducing the changing variables to as few changing variables as possible. So in an experiment, we set pretty much everything to be constant, except for like 1 or 2 or 3 variables. The author was saying that any more than 3 variables actually causes the analysis to be very difficult. It's not a useful experiment anymore. So we want as few variables as possible. But then he said, stories are like experiments, except that stories have basically an unlimited number of variables. That's actually the point of the story, is that any person can get any number of meanings from a story. So stories mean things to different people, whereas an experiment only means one thing, the outcome and the prediction and how they vary based on the variable. So the story tells you based on these, based on this scenario, with all the, the unknown factors in play and how they interact with each other, this is the outcome you can expect. So you can map it onto other things more fluidly. An experiment is very rigid. It's very hard to map it onto something else because there's so few things that are unknowns. Everything is pretty much known about the experiment. We do it in conditions that we can measure everything. So, and that's why we say that doing something in the real world is different than doing it in the lab. And that's why experiments are done in a vacuum, and the real world actually, like, we have an atmosphere, we have air. It isn't a vacuum. So there's a lot more complexity there. And that's why we can't just extrapolate from an experiment to the real world. A lab situation is very different from the real world. Now, stories are the real world. There is all the complexity bound up in that story. There are unknown factors that in play and how things interact, all the interactions between all the variables. We don't understand it all, but that's why it makes for a good metaphor. People can, it's a little bit more fuzzy, and there's more ways it can overlap, which means that there's more differences, but there's also more similarities. And stories are more fluid in that way. We can apply them to more situations than we could an experiment. So, yes, analogies are like stories in that sense, to use an analogy. The analogy also reflects the interactions between causal factors, interactions we cannot specify, so it lets us make a prediction that reflects factors whose existence we do not know and whose properties we don't understand. That is the power of analogical reasoning. If we did not want to use analogical reasoning for tasks like these, we would be stuck. We would not know enough to construct formulas, or to use them, or to have hard enough information to proceed. By using analogues, we are tapping into the same source of power for stories. Look at me go, man. Like 2 paragraphs ahead. I feel like I could have nailed that a little bit earlier. I felt it coming. Okay. I could feel the the metaphor building. I could feel it, the similarities, overlapping. I could see it. But I'm getting better at like anticipating what the author is saying. at pretty much 3 pages ago is when I felt that coming up. So you gotta be reading books, guys. You gotta be reading books and thinking about them, because it makes reading the next book that much easier. It makes anticipating what someone's gonna say all the more easier to predict, and things become less of, you know, hearing a president make a speech, you can almost anticipate what the beginning is going to sound like, and what the ending is going to sound like, just from the first few words. You can know how they're going to end the speech from the opening sentence, from the opening line, and it's kind of crazy. You start to feel like, you know, the curtain's been pulled back. You start to feel like, things are just mechanical, like, uh, you know, the universe is kind of like a machine, and it kind of is. Okay, there is a lot of mechanics that are repetitive, and they work in the same ways, and they're not all that different. Fucking motorcycles. That's pretty repetitive. That's happened in pretty much every space. Some fucking asshole on a two-stroke engine bike drives by every time. But anyways, yeah, you start to notice the patterns. You start to recognize the similarities between all the mechanisms that at play, all the forces at work, all the players. You get to remember how people act and what they say and the different thought processes, and then you build up the patterns into, you know, think tanks, entire organizations. You can imagine what an entire think tank might think about some situation, what kind of, you know, statement they might make on some world event. You know, Nick was able to predict exactly what JD Vance was going to say based on, you know, essays he had written, and you know, previous speeches he had given, where we all are bound up in some kind of ideology and some kind of worldview and some kind of religion. We all have these priors, and they inform our decisions. We've all told the same stories. We've all heard them. We've all exchanged the same ideas, and you know, it's a little bit different person to person, and it's different organization to organization, but there's so many similarities. If you're paying attention and you're making a mental note of, you know, this person said this and that person said that, then, you know, drawing the line between the two, connecting the dots isn't that hard. You can start to anticipate what people are going to say and what kind of statements organizations are going to make on wildly different events that haven't happened yet, events that have happened 60 years ago, events that have happened 1,500 years ago. So read books, get experience, go talk to people, see what the world's about, go explore, get outside your comfort zone, and make mental notes, think about things, reflect, start to take things apart and make the narrative, draw the conclusions. Um, write the stories that people would want to hear, and imagine you're telling and summarizing the story to someone. The best way to conceptualize this is, if you had to explain this to somebody, how would you do it? How would you tell someone about what the Intercollegiate Studies Institute would make of the Trump assassination? How would you summarize that to someone? What kind of statement would they make? So it's all about being able to articulate your thoughts and put things together and draw conclusions. This is what people are doing every day. People have jobs that are just about thinking and connecting things and making predictions. That's an entire position. That's an entire role in an organization, is just thinking. So get good at it. Be useful. Be someone who can do those things reliably and consistently. Be someone who's known for thinking and someone who's known for having good ideas that make powerful predictions in the world. You can know things about the world. You can know things about the world, okay? You can know things. Things are knowable. I know that sounds stupid. That sounds like a tautology, but so many people tell you can't know anything. You can go learn about the world, okay? You don't have to ask for permission. You don't have to wait for someone to tell you that you can open a book in class. Open your books to page 293. Go to the second paragraph. You don't have to wait for that. You don't have to wait for someone to tell you that you can start the race. You can just go. okay? The world is your oyster. Anyways, let me take a drink and we'll get into example 12.3, rejecting an analog that is identical. An engineer finds that the auxiliary power unit on the B1 will be identical to the auxiliary power unit used on a cargo plane, the C-5A. The engineer judges that the demands on the auxiliary power unit from a bomber like the B-1 are going to be so different and so much greater than on a cargo plane that he throws out the C-5A data completely. Bombers may have to scramble, which means starting up and taking off in a hurry without waiting for everything to warm up gradually. Unlike a cargo plane, all sorts of systems are started up at once, placing great burdens on the auxiliary power system. In addition, bombers may have to conduct sharp maneuvers to avoid enemy fighters and anti-aircraft missiles. Cargo planes are not subjected to these types of forces. Because of the difference in the working environment, the engineer concluded that the data from cargo operations would not help him. That's a subtle difference, the cargo plane versus the bomber. It's not something you'd really think about if you weren't designing the power systems for a plane, but that's what it takes to be an expert. You have to know all about planes and how they're used and how they maneuver and what kind of startup sequences they have and what kind of power systems they have. So the subtleties, it's all about the details. From these examples, Julian and I learned a great deal about how people use analogical reasoning in a natural setting. First, we learned that they do not select analogs just based on similarity. If you are buying a green car, you don't try to find the reliability records for green cars. That's brat coded, by the way. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You would select an analog that shares the same dynamics, the same factors that affect what you are trying to predict. If you don't have enough experience to take causal factors into account, you can get into trouble. Yeah, like if you conflate green with being a causal factor with how a car performs, the color, the paint job with how the car performs, that's what kids do. That's what toddlers do. They just like, I like the green car. And the green car's the fastest, duh, because green's my favorite color. They conflate something that has nothing to do with performance with the performance of the car, the machine. So we gotta upgrade our analogs. We gotta, as you become an expert, your analogs get more sophisticated and complex. So that's what you have to do. That's when you want to learn something about, George Washington. Is it enough to know that he was a white guy? Is that your analog for deciding what to think about George Washington? That's what liberals think. They apply that analog. They say George Washington was a white guy, therefore he committed the great sin of slavery. That's my analysis of George Washington. I'll be taking I'll take my check next. I'll take my check in my PO box. Thank you very much. You can Venmo me for that one. You can just hit me on my Cash App. So, yeah, we got to be more sophisticated than that. Our analogs have to be a little bit better. We got to think a little bit deeper about these things. Deep politics, okay? The Wendelian analysis. The engineers we studied were all knowledgeable. Later, when Chris Brezovic, Martin Thordson, and I studied the decision-making of new tank platoon leaders, we found that analogical reasoning was about as likely to hurt them as to help them. For example, during one mission, the tank platoon leader had decided to use a certain route because he had used it 3 days earlier when the exercise had been in the same area. However, he was inexperienced. He didn't consider the fact that it had rained heavily the night before. This time, when he sent his tanks down that route, the first two got stuck in the mud, and the whole mission fell apart. He thought he had a perfect analog for selecting a route that would work, but he missed a key difference. Second, We learned that some causal factors are easy to adjust for and others just aren't. If pressure affects the reliability of a hydraulic system, then even if I can pick an analog with a different pressurization, I can just multiply to get an estimate. That is easy. So like ratios, kind of just guesstimating, I guess, just scaling things up and down. So that's easy. But on the other hand, if the pattern of use affects the reliability of an auxiliary power unit, because the strains of a bombing run are vastly different from the smooth profile of a cargo flight, then I don't know how to make this adjustment. Yeah, it's different. It's not just a different scalar, it's a different vector. It's a different space. As a result, I must throw the analog out altogether, even if the equipment is identical. If the difference can be captured as a proportion, then the causal factor can be adjusted for. If it cannot be reduced to a proportion, then we would only try to guess at the adjustment if we were desperate. Julian concluded that we select analogues on the mysterious features, the qualitative categories that we cannot easily adjust. And then we adjust on the more straightforward features. We would select an analog airplane that flew the same type of mission and adjust on a size dimension. We would not select an analog that matched on size and adjust on type of mission. That's interesting. Yeah, the fucking motorcycles, man. Right down my street. Fuck you. So annoying. It's like 3 a.m. here. Why are people driving around? It's a holiday, too. It's a freaking holiday. Go home, man. Anyways. Third, we learned that the logic of reasoning by analogy is similar to the logic of an experiment, to draw a conclusion without having to know all of the important factors operating. Imagine that someone comes back from the Brazilian rainforest with a new drug derived from the leaves that grow above the canopy of vines and branches, and claims that the drug will cure AIDS. We might test it in an experiment by identifying AIDS victims to serve as subjects, randomly assigning them to an experimental group that gets the drug and a control group that does not. We would see if the AIDS patients in the experimental group improve compared to the control group. If they do improve, we conclude that the drug had an effect. Notice that we draw this conclusion even though we do not know all the causes of AIDS, and we do not know how the causes we have identified interact. We know, everyone in this space knows how AIDS is spread and what causes AIDS, okay? I'll just leave that to your guys' imaginations. By randomly assigning the subjects, we could feel confident that the same causal factors were at work in the two groups, although we did not know what they were. Similarly, when we use an analogy, we are trying to set up a condition where the same causal factors are at work, even though we don't know what they are. The analog is selected to match on the causal variables as closely as possible, and we adjust the data to take into account aspects where we know the matching is inadequate. Sometimes we don't take into account the variables that are important because we do not know about them. That is why we have less confidence in analogical reasoning than in the results of an experiment. Analogical reasoning is intended to be a guide in cases where we cannot set up experiments, cases where we do not know enough to work out the equations. Yeah, I was actually getting into that probably 10 paragraphs ago. So that's actually, yeah, we're doing good, guys. We're getting better at reading, okay? We're able to predict what the author is going to write 10 paragraphs ahead. There is a delicate balance to using analogies. If we know a great amount, we do not need the analogs. We can just figure out the formulas. If we know very little, analogical reasoning may be as likely to get us into trouble as to help us. Analogical reasoning seems to help us most when we are in between. We know something about the area, but not enough for a satisfactory analysis. Just as we discussed in the previous chapter on the power of stories, an analog represents a set of causal variables interacting with each other. By using and adjusting the analog, we are making predictions that incorporate factors that we cannot identify. So it's like we're like isolating a group of variables. We can control for a few, and that's the part of the analog that we're okay with, mapping onto the thing that we're trying to predict. But then there's this group of variables. We have no idea how they interact. We have no idea what they mean for us. We can't formulate them, but it's quantifiable in the sense that we can allow for that gap in our knowledge. We can allow for that rough estimate. It's okay that there's some, it's like it's like when someone says to color outside the lines or color inside the lines, and you go outside the lines a little bit, but it turns out that outside the line we use the same color. It's okay. But if you color outside the line into a space that's a different color, it's like, well, that's where your analog should be very tight. That's where the boundaries of the analog should not overlap with something else. It should be 1-to-1. It shouldn't be a rough guess there. But where it doesn't matter, where you're not sure of the formula, that's where you can kind of guess, and you can hope that that's the part that doesn't really matter. You can hope that those are the forces at play that you don't really understand, but they all interfere with only each other, and maybe those variables just cancel each other out, and you can just ignore them like you have for the previous iterations, the previous examples. It's the same color. The next question to investigate was how accurate these predictions are. To find out, I collected a set of predictions that had been made on the A-10 aircraft. I obtained the comparability analysis predictions made during the design of the A-10 and compared them to the actual reliability data. In the hands of experienced engineers, predictions made from the analogies matched up fairly well with the actual data, and that's from Klein in 1986. The correlation between the A-10 predictions. All right, now I'm just thinking about the eye chart. The correlation between the A-10 predictions and the A-10 data on the mean time between failures was statistically significant at positive 0.76. For another measure, mean maintenance hours per flying hour, the correlation was even higher, at positive 0.84. Some predictions weren't very accurate. The correlation between predicted and actual repair time was only positive 0.36. I found that these were cases where the engineers lacked solid data for the chosen analogs, and had generated their own estimates. We got some comments here. Let me jump down here. Let's see what we got. Eidolon is right about small animals. That was 34 minutes ago from Stimulant. And Stimulant says common A10W. That's true. This lesson seems important. The method of using analogs uses so much subjective estimation that it needs to be grounded in hard data. If we make up the data that we then adjust, the accuracy drops. Example 12.4, predicting the attendance at a movie theater. I live in a village, Yellow Springs, Ohio, Skibbity, with a population of less than 4,000. It has some pleasant restaurants and shops where artisans sell pottery, clothing, and paintings. It has a wonderful movie theater, that The Little Art, which plays movies that never come to multiplex theaters in malls. Antioch College is aware of how important the theater is to the community, so when the theater is about to close, the college purchases it. The college does not want to lose money on the deal, so it requires the people running it to at least break even. Jenny Calperthwaite, what the hell kind of name is that? Jenny Calperthwaite COWPERTHWAITE, the long-term manager of the theater, can no longer just show movies that are important or receive critical acclaim regardless of their popular appeal, like Orion's Belt. She needs to figure out which movies are going to attract large audiences. To help her out, Dan Friedman in the psychology department at Antioch College, and also a movie fan, arranges for a student who needs an honors project to go through the Little Art database. The student assembles all the information the Little Art has gathered on all the movies they have shown in the previous 10 years. Dan and the student and I figure out a set of categories for coding each movie: action, romance, political, American, British, subtitled, cartoon, documentary, revival, and so forth. The student enters these data into a database and we analyze the trends. We can identify the types of movies that seem to draw the largest crowds and the ones that we should never book again. When we are done, we have a chance for a study, using this database to make predictions about the attendance at future movies. The Little Art shows 2 movies a week. We select an upcoming 18-week span during which the movie theater is going to play 35 movies. One plays for a full week. For each movie, Dan and I try to find an analog, a movie close to it, that had already played at the Little Art and is in the database. We retrieve the data on that movie, look at its characteristics, make the adjustments, and generate a prediction. We do this for all 35 movies. Next, we go to a control group of 17 people who live or work in Yellow Springs and ask each to predict the attendance at each of the upcoming 35 movies. We also collect one more data point. We ask the manager, Jenny, to make her predictions without using the database. Then Dan and I wait for the 35 movies to be shown to tally up the outcomes. The control group predicts slightly better than chance. The correlation between their median predictions and the actual attendance is positive 0.17, which is not very high. Jenny does much better. Her predictions correlate positively, 0.31, with the actual numbers. Dan and I are 2 amateurs who have never booked a movie in our lives. Our predictions correlate positively at 0.45, the highest of all. This is a tribute not to our experience or our math abilities. This is the fact that we use the database filled with analogs. So this is kind of like, it's telling you that experts are good at making analogs. So probably the previous 10 chapters were all about how experts use experience to make careful analysis. But this is flying in the face of that. This is saying experts can use analogies, which doesn't require any experience of the thing itself at all. If you are just good at making analogies, that is kind of an expertise. If you're good at, finding the similarities between 2 pieces of data, then that kind of makes you an expert. So maybe pattern recognition, maybe being able to evaluate the similarities of 2 things is an expertise. Maybe that's part of expertise. Something to consider here. Let me take a drink and we'll keep going. If anybody has any questions or comments, or they want to add to the discussion, if you want to ask anything about the book or the chapter or anything related, feel free to request. And if I think you'll add to the conversation, I'll bring you guys up. People regularly use analogical reasoning. If you want to sell your house, the realtor estimates its market value by calling up a database of houses that have recently been sold to capture the current demand for houses in your area. The realtor looks for houses like yours, the same neighborhood, the same style. These are difficult variables to adjust for. It is easier to match on them and adjust for number of square feet and size of lot. If the house you are selling has a swimming pool, but none of the good matches has one, the realtor may estimate the value of the swimming pool separately by looking through the database for two houses that are virtually identical, except for a swimming pool. The difference between them is the value of the pool, and the realtor can factor this into your home. The logic and the procedures are virtually identical to what the engineers were doing in estimating reliability, and to what Dan and I did to predict movie attendance. This section has concentrated on one use of analogical reasoning, making predictions, as a way to illustrate how analogues are retrieved and modified. There are several other ways that we use analogues to generate expectancies and solve problems. This is how we generate expectancies. Analogues can be extended to help project what is going to happen in a new situation. Refer back to example 2.1 concerning the threat of a falling billboard at the scene of a fire. The commander looked up and saw a billboard on the top of a building. He remembered a previous fire, an analogue, in which the flames had burned through the wooden supports for a billboard, sending the billboard crashing down. The commander then ordered that the crowds of onlookers be moved back a safe distance in case the same thing should happen. The analogue provided him with the expectancy that he used to anticipate and avoid a potential problem. Analogues and metaphors also provide scientists with the new hypotheses in some of the ways that they provide decision-maker with expectancies. Solving problems. Analogues provide the problem solver with a recommendation about what to do. In doing a homework assignment in mathematics, a student will look back through the notes to find any exercises that the teacher did that can be used as a template to follow the same strategy. The logic of this process is the same as the logic for making predictions. Recall a previous case that had used the same dynamics as the current one. Identify the strategy used, modify it to meet the current requirements, and carry out the arithmetic. Even if you do not have a chance to think it all through, you trust that the causal factors are roughly the same, so the procedure should work. You have selected the analog in the first place because it matches on the other causal factors. As we saw earlier, you need a certain amount of experience to use analogical reasoning reliably. Novices run the risk of missing important causal factors and therefore choosing the wrong example as a model or misapplying that example. So like the example of like the toddler that looks at two toy cars, a green one and a red one, and he looks at two real cars, and or even just like one real car. We can reduce it down to the example of a single car. A kid sees a really fast green car, and then he sees the green toy car at the store. He's like, man, that one must be fast, because he's thinking about the color as the causal factor for what made the car fast. Kids don't know about engines. They don't know about, torque. They don't have the formulas for how fast a car goes or the wind resistance or anything like that. They don't know the physics, the equations for motion. They don't need to know that. They just need to know green cars go fast, man. So novices do need experience. You do need to know like the engine bay size, the wheel size, the tire patterns, all these things, the temperature of the road. All these things are going to tell you how fast a car can go, how fast it can accelerate, all the intricacies of the motion of a car. So yes, we do need to know the causal factors. And the more causal factors that you can account for, the better your analogies can be, because you can hone in on what's not the same, and you can hone in on, like, you can make the parts that change the parts that you don't know. And if you know pretty much everything except for one little detail, like the swimming pool on a house, when you're making an evaluation of the price of the house, you can just, find two similar things that the only difference is the swimming pool. And there you go. You got the price of the swimming pool, and then you can apply that. So it's all about knowing the causal factors. It's about knowing what goes into an analogy, what makes two things similar. For each example, the teacher could describe the choice points in the solution where someone might have taken the wrong path or chosen the wrong formula. The teacher could explain the cues the expert used in avoiding these traps. In that way, learners get the advantage of the examples, along with guidance on the principles they have to learn to safely apply the examples. System designers make frequent use of analogues. They draw on previous projects that they did or on other people's projects with which they are familiar. In studying the types of evidence and information on which designers rely, Klein and Brezovic in 1986, found that design engineers prefer to gather first-hand evidence by running little demonstrations using mock-ups. When demonstrations are impractical, the design engineers looked for previous systems to serve as analogs. They used these analogs to tell them which tolerances to use, what configurations, and so forth. We have also seen designers run into trouble by misusing analogs. In the following example, the designers ignored important causal factors and believed they had a match when they should have rejected the analog altogether. Example 12.5, a case where AWACS was the wrong analog. The Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS, is a new aircraft designed to fly close to battle lines and look down at the adversary's movements. JSTARS is going to be flying as close to the battle lines as possible, putting it in the range of anti-aircraft weapons. Because of the risk, JSTARS needs to have a dedicated workstation to manage its own defense. The designers try to understand what needs to go into the self-defense suite and use the AWACS aircraft as an analog. The designers conclude that self-defense will not be much of a problem because it has not been a problem for the AWACS. Both aircraft are slow-moving and not very maneuverable. AWACS has a large number of weapons directors at radar scopes to keep an eye out for trouble, and JSTARS will also have a number of people at radar scopes. It seems like a good analog, transferring the AWACS experience to the JSTARS, except that the JSTARS will not have a dedicated air support, interceptors whose primary task it is to protect it, the way AWACS does. Also, the people on the radar scopes will be searching for the ground for enemy movement. In AWACS, the weapons directors are looking at the air picture. JSTARS has very little capability for looking out for airplanes that might be attacking it, whereas AWACS can see for hundreds of miles away. AWACS is a secure platform, whereas JSTARS is a giant kick-me sign in the sky. It will be flying a slow and predictable course, generating lots of electrical signals for an enemy to home in on. In our judgment, the AWACS analog misled the original design team, so they did not give the self-defense function sufficient attention. During Operation Desert Storm, the U.S. Air Force did use JSTARS. However, it made sure that there were no enemy fighters or anti-aircraft batteries around, and they provided escorts of friendly fighters to protect JSTARS. So that's the final example. We're going to get into the applications, and then we'll get into the key points, and that'll be the end of the chapter. Like I said, if any of you guys want to come up and speak, if you have anything you want to add, if you have any questions about the book or this chapter, feel free to request, and I can bring you guys up. Applications. Two types of applications stand out: using analogs in comparability analysis and using them in advanced computer reasoning systems. The technique of comparability analysis has been used for many different functions during the past 20 years. It has also been misused, most notably by careless technicians who did not bother making adjustments. For instance, in one case, the reliability data for a piece of naval equipment were simply plugged into an army project, ignoring the fact that ships tend to float smoothly, whereas tanks and trucks bounce around. The predictions were not accurate. Failures such as this will reduce the credibility of the method, even though the failure was in the application of the method. The method was misused because the people applying it did not understand the logic behind it. In our own work on analogical reasoning, we found scant opportunity to use comparability analysis. Most people are fully capable of reasoning by analogy themselves. We cannot do much except to give a technical name to what they are already doing. And by the way, that's very important. To be able to articulate how you think and why you think something, to be able to explain to other people in words through a vocalization, through a sentence and a report. Like if you can give someone a stack of paper that explains why you're going to do something, it's much more believable. You can think about it in the reliability of something. You will trust a tweet a lot less than a presidential report. So the the whole thing, the whole reason we didn't believe that, well, I'm going to say we, but I'm just talking about the internet broadly. The whole reason the internet had trouble believing that Joe Biden was still alive was that his what would you call it? It was his presidential declaration, proclamation. What do we want to call that? I can't think of that. It was just like an announcement. Anyways, I'm just getting hung up on a word. His release, his press release that he was saying he's stepping down and he's not going to be running it for the upcoming election. It wasn't on letterhead. It was like only a digital representation. It's like when someone's forgot to do their homework and they send like a picture of their internet down or something like, yo, professor, can I get more time on this project? My internet's out. I'm on vacation and I don't have any internet, blah, blah, blah. It's not like a note from the doctor. It's like when the note from the doctor is like a picture of a note from the doctor. Like you trust it a lot less. So it's giving a technical solution or giving a technical reason for why you believe something or why something's true is very important. It has to have credibility. You have to have some kind of authenticity to the reasoning and to the judgments that you make. You can't just say, because I feel like that's true, or like everybody else said so. Those are logical fallacies. I know that's kind of like, that's actually a logical fallacy. You're using the appeal to authority right now. I know that's like Reddit tier. I get it, but in the real world, like when you're actually doing careful analysis, you cannot fall into those traps. If your job is to succeed, you can't fail because you made a Reddit mistake. So I'm just giving you guys the warning that sometimes you have to be Reddit. Sometimes you have to put on your serious hat, okay? And it sucks and you're going to get made fun of, but it's true. That's real life. So you got to be able to articulate yourself. You got to have a sound reasoning. You got to be able to prove that what you're saying is authentic and credible, that you're a professional. How are you going to tell someone that you're a professional if the best reason for doing something is you feel like it, okay? That's not going to cut it. We prepared a description of how to do a more thorough job of using analogues in making predictions. We found that most people are fairly satisfied and do not want to go through the extra effort. Yeah, people are lazy. Wow, there's another example. Okay, we're getting more examples even in the applications section of this chapter. So we're going to keep going. It looks like it keeps going. One type of assistance is to build a computer-based system for helping people retrieve and use analogues or prior cases. Computer scientists have been exploring the use of systems based on analogical reasoning. And by the way, that's pretty much all LLMs do. Large language models, ChatGPT, what we call AI or machine learning, pretty much all of it is analogical reasoning. It's just associations, okay? If you want to understand why I keep saying that AI is not alive, it's not reasoning, it's not doing any thinking, it's not actually learning, it's just learning how to, it's like, it's finding the best associations between two things based on some given input and some given output. So you have some restriction, you have some qualification for how to associate these two things, how to classify these two things, and it's just making judgments based on how to better do that. So yes, AI is a very powerful tool for making analogies, making associations between things, like classifying things, especially language-based things. But it is not thinking, okay? It's not alive. It's not going to take over. It's not going to start reasoning tomorrow. It's all just associations. So if anybody tries to tell you that ChatGPT is, sentient, or that it's, we've reached the singularity, or it's super intelligent, that's just not true. It's not even intelligent yet. It's just an association. And that's one type of reasoning, okay? The whole point of this book is to give you insights into all the different types of reasoning. Analogical reasoning is only one of them. So it's not enough. We got to use the full range of our reasoning capabilities. Roger Schank, Schank, now at Northwestern University, was one of the leaders of this movement, along with Janet Kolodner, Kolodner, Georgia Tech University, and Chris Hammond, Hammond, University of Chicago. Edwina Rissland, Rissland, at the University of Massachusetts, has studied the use of case-based reasoning for providing legal advice. Several case-based reasoning shells are currently available. Here is an example of one of the case-based reasoning projects on which we worked. This project, sponsored by the Air Force Materials Laboratory, was intended to demonstrate how analogical reasoning could be applied in the area of manufacturing. All right, let's go. This is about to get Hamiltonian. Machines to do the work for us. Let's go. Example 12.6, Bidder's Associate. Yeah, if we could replace all lawyers with machines, that's actually pretty cool. That's actually a good idea. I like the idea of computers replacing the Jews. It's like Nick's speech. You're not going to replace us. We will replace you. Yeah, that's so true. Okay. All right. AI is Hamiltonian. AI is based. Let's go. Bidder's Associate. Most manufacturing companies keep records of previous work, and these records could be a valuable database for making bids on future work. However, the data are kept by part number, and when time is short, the marketing department may not be able to find the right case. Maybe someone will remember, hey, didn't we make something like that 3 years ago? And then, with luck, they may track down the part number and find out what it had cost. More often, the reply will be, you might be right, but I have no idea how to dig that out. So they will start from scratch in preparing their bid. We set up a working relationship with a manufacturing company near us. Enginetics, a job shop that makes jet engine parts to order. In contrast to companies that turn out the same part again and again, firms like Enginetics are called on to make the unique parts of which people need only a few copies. With each new job, they are challenged to determine if they can make it, and, if so, what process they will use. They have to trade off the costs of the processes, bore the holes on this machine, then shape it on that machine, and so forth, against the time needed for each step and even the scrap materials. It may be easier to make it one way, but they will wind up with too much scrap, so it is better to use a different strategy that takes longer. They even have to take their own learning curve into account. There may be a clever new approach, but they know it might take them 4 to 5 runs before they get it right, and they don't have enough time or profit margin to gamble. Each job is a brand new problem to be solved. That is Hamiltonian. Let's go. This is so good. And 3D printing is kind of, that kind of fits this niche pretty well. 3D printing is like, I mean, of course, once you have the design correct, once you have a model that can be printed reliably, once you figure out the right way to model something, yeah, you can make like infinite copies. And right now it's kind of limited. We can kind of do like light plastics to dense plastics, and we can kind of do a mix of both while we're printing, but we haven't really gotten good at like printing metal yet. I know we can do lightweight aluminums. I think we're getting good at printing. There's some welders, like welding style 3D printing that can kind of print metal onto other metal. And that's like, it's cutting edge. It's stuff that you can't do at home. It's pretty much only industrial. I've seen a lot of 3D, and they call it 3D printing, but it's like they're like sculpting it. They're like carving it out. I've seen a lot of stuff like that. But the coolest ones that I've seen, the coolest examples are making the propellers for like submarines. A lot of them are like 3D printed metal. What the hell is going on? 3D printed like metal, and it's like they're using molten metal, and they're like zapping it onto the shape of a propeller. So it's like building it out from like nothing. It's just like sculpting it in real time, and it's so cool looking. The time lapse is like one of the coolest things you can see. It's just like making it. It's like shaping it out of nothing. It's yeah, that's Hamiltonian, man. Few things are like that. Few things are as cool as that. Our agreement is to build a system to help the marketing staff find and use prior cases. This is a case-based reasoning system. Although the system does not do much reasoning, its primary value is helping the planners find relevant cases and use the information contained in them. We help them assemble their corporate history, the jobs they bid, including the ones they lost, and the history of manufacturing the parts for the jobs they won. Buzz Reed, the CEO of my company, and David Klinger performed this project. Their system is called Bidders Associate. Bidders Associate uses the existing database. In preparing a bid on a new part, it lets the staff rapidly search through their files to see if they made anything like it in the past. Sometimes they find a previous instance with the same part number, which is great, unless the cost of materials or something like that have changed. More often, there are no simple matches, and the system has to find similar cases. We code the previous cases on several features, such as size, type of material, and even popular names. For example, a round part that has slots cut into it was given the nickname Turkey Feather Assembly. That is how everyone refers to it, so that gets put into the file to help its retrieval. Bidders Associate finds a number of similar cases and lets the operator pick which ones to work with to adjust. The output is a documented bid with the cost categories so that everyone will know the reasoning behind the bid. The output includes a concept of how the part will be made if Enginetics wins the bid. The system allows bids to be prepared with less time and effort, and the company also has more confidence in these bids. Bidders Associate is delivered in 1989. Wow, that's pretty early for computing. The first time a process engineer uses Bidders Associate, the first case that pops up on the screen is nearly a perfect match, a part they made 2 years ago. He had not worked on the earlier project, but he recognizes that it is a mirror image of the one he is bidding on. He reads that the earlier part had a 30% scrap rate, so he goes to the shop floor and finds that the scrap rate can now be drastically reduced. He is able to prepare a bid with a clear idea of how the company will manufacture the exact item. That's the end of the applications. We've reached the key points, which is the final section of the chapter. It's only a few sentences, so we've got like a minute or two left in this chapter. If anybody has anything to add, they have any questions, or they just want to talk about the chapter or the book, feel free to request, and I'll bring you up if I think you add to the conversation. I'll read these key points and then we'll get out of here. So, finishing up the chapter. Key points. Metaphors and analogues direct thinking by framing situation awareness, identifying appropriate goals, and flagging relevant pieces of information. Analogues provide a structure for making predictions when there are many unknown factors. Analogues function like experiments, linking interactive sets of causes to outcomes. By taking into account the difference between the analog and the current case, we can adjust the analog data to derive a prediction. Analog predictions are most helpful when there is a good database, but not enough information to apply more rigorous analyses. And finally, analogs are useful for generating expectancies in solving problems. Okay, that's the end of chapter 12. It's been almost 2 hours, closer to an hour and a half, but thank you guys for listening. Thanks for stopping by. You guys can catch me next time with chapter 13, The Power to Read Minds. I'm going to the Olympics for this weekend, so I'm going to go check out I think it's the archery. Yeah, I think it's the archery, and we're going to go see the volleyball game. So I'll be up in Paris for that. I'll be traveling tomorrow, so I will not be around this weekend. I probably won't do any reading, so you'll have to catch me Monday or Tuesday night at the earliest for chapter 13, but keep that in mind. Put a bookmark in for that. But thanks, guys, for listening. Thanks for stopping by. I'll catch you next time. Have a good rest of your night, and God bless.